Hello, so in this video I'm going to talk through topic 2 of Edexcel A-level history, civil rights in the USA 1850 2000 to 2009. And this topic is the topic that covers the implementation of Jim Crow in the late 19th century. So I'm going to go through, as I did with topic 1, I'm going to go through the specification, then the key content, then breaking down the content, and then looking at the past questions. So to begin with, onto the specification. So there's 4 points here. The first one is about the Supreme Court cases in 1883, which basically are upholding states' rights and really open the door to Jim Crow legislation being passed by the southern states, starting with rail travel in Florida in 1887. And then point 2 is about the exclusion of black voters. So Mississippi, Louisiana, and the huge decline in black voter numbers. So things like the grandfather clauses, poll tax, and disenfranchisement of black Americans in the South in the late 19th century. Point 3 is about the specific Supreme Court cases. So Plessy versus Ferguson, which upholds separate but equal. Mississippi versus Williams, which is to do with voting, it upholds voting qualifications. Cumming versus Board of Education, which says that segregated schooling is constitutional. So all of those, basically, the Supreme Court are giving the green light to Jim Crow laws. And point 4 is a bit more positive for black Americans, and it's about black resistance. So black American campaigners and leaders, Booker T. Washington, who advocates practical kind of self-help, economic self-help, vocational training, working within the system. And then you've got Du Bois, who is a counter to that, more intellectual, talking about the talented, the top 10th, the talented 10th of black Americans who should pursue intellectual pursuits, academia, and writing. Then we've got Ida B. Wells, who campaigns against lynching in the South and is forced to flee the South because of that. And then you've got the establishment of the NAACP in 1909 as a civil rights organization that campaigns through the courts for black American civil rights. Okay, so that's the specification. Now onto the timeline, and these are the key events. So 1877, end of Reconstruction. 1883, I've already mentioned the civil rights cases in the Supreme Court, where the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which we mentioned in topic 1, is declared unconstitutional. 1887, we've got the Thibodeau Massacre in Louisiana, again an example of white violence against black Americans in the South as a form of kind of social control. Then we've got, also in 1887, the Florida Railroad segregation, which is introduced in Mississippi in the following year. 1890, Mississippi's constitution changed to exclude black voters, and also in 1890, the Louisiana Separate Car Act, so segregation in transportation extending into Louisiana. 1892, new voting regulations introduced in Mississippi, again to disenfranchise black Americans, to put barriers to black Americans in terms of voting. 1895, Booker T. Washington's Atlanta speech, which was called his Atlanta Compromise by his critics, as I said before, in terms of working within the system and focusing on practical vocational training. 1896, the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, which accepts separate but equal. 1898, Louisiana introduced a grandfather clause, again another way of limiting black American voting. Mississippi versus Williams, as I said, 1898, endorses changes to voting in Mississippi. 1899, Cumming v. Board of Education upholds segregated schooling. 1900, IWR's pamphlet published against lynching in the South. By 1900, only 3% of black males could vote, so a huge decline from the end of Reconstruction to 1900. So these mechanisms put in place by the Southern states really, really limit and hinder Black American ability to vote. And in this period, 1880 to 1900, over 1,600, almost 1,700 lynchings took place. So just highlighting the extent of the violence against Black Americans. In 1905, the Niagara Movement was founded by W.E.B. Du Bois, and in 1909, it's not on here, but 1909 was when the NAACP was established. So that's the story of topic 2. It's basically the taking back of that legislation, finding the loopholes in the legislation from Reconstruction, and the limiting of Black American voting, particularly the implementation of Jim Crow laws. And then we start seeing Black American resistance, Black American campaigns as a reaction. Okay, so in terms of the content breakdown, there really isn't a great deal of motivating factors in terms of things that are pushing ahead, that are advancing Black American civil rights. The story of this topic, as I've just said, really is about the limiting of those rights. So the only real motivating factor, as I see it, is the Black American campaigners. So I.D.B. Wells, Washington, Du Bois, the NAACP. You could potentially get a question on one of those, comparing them to the others. But I think it's quite unlikely that there would be a question on what was the most significant factor to advance Black American civil rights in this period, because I don't think many historians would argue that Black American civil rights did advance in this period. I think this is a period of Black American civil rights being diminished. However, there are lots of questions on obstacles. So what was the most significant obstacle to Black American civil rights being advanced? So you've got the Supreme Court, you've got Southern states and the legislation they introduced, and you've got white attitudes. And I'm going to go through the past questions in a minute where we'll look at those. In terms of social, political, economic, I think it's important to break down the content in that way, because we're talking about civil rights. So you could talk about social rights, the end of the Civil Rights Act, so the implementation of Jim Crow and segregation. You've also got lynching and violence. In terms of political rights, we've got really the hindering of Black American political rights, voting restrictions, and that being upheld by the Supreme Court. However, a counterpoint could be that you start getting the emergence of Black American leadership and political campaigns like the NAACP. Economically, lots of continuation here. Sharecropping continues. Segregation, you could argue, gets really increases because of Jim Crow. So that could be an economic hindrance as well. But I would argue maybe a continuation. Okay, now on to the past questions. So there have been 3 past questions: 2018, 2020, and 2021. So 2018, the exclusion of Black Americans from the vote was the most damaging setback to their fight for civil rights in the years 1883 to circa 1900. How far do you agree with this statement? So that's an obstacles question. In fact, all of these past questions have been obstacle questions. So you'd start off by talking about exclusion from voting. Then you could maybe talk about Supreme Court decisions. Then you could talk about other things that the Southern states did, the Jim Crow laws. Or within that, you could talk about attitudes, white attitudes being a hindrance in terms of a setback. And then within each of the other paragraphs, you're comparing it back to the exclusion from voting. Question 2. In the years to 1900, it was the Supreme Court that was most responsible for undermining the rights that Black Americans had gained from Reconstruction. How far do you agree? Again, it's an obstacle question. So you're going to start off with Supreme Court. Then you could talk about Southern states. Then you could talk about white attitudes. Again, as I always say, this is just an approach. It's not necessarily the best approach. If you can think of a better way or a different way, that's great. Finally, from 2021, the Supreme Court ruling in the case Plessy versus Ferguson was the most damaging setback to the Black American struggle against racial discrimination in the years 1883 to 1900. How far do you agree with this statement? So it's an obstacle question again. Supreme Court, paragraph 1, Southern states and the other things that Southern states did paragraph 2, and then you can talk about white attitudes, paragraph 3. Obviously, it doesn't have to be in that order. I'd always start with the one in the question, but you could do white attitudes as paragraph 2 if you wanted to. Okay, I hope that was useful. If you've got any questions, or if you want me to go into any more detail of any of the points that I've covered here, please just let me know in the comments. Thanks for listening.